Is the soul real? Neuroscience versus religious dualism. Somewhere between the electrical firing of 100 billion neurons and the felt experience of being you, one of the oldest questions in human thought still refuses to resolve. Is there a soul, some essence of you that could, in principle, survive the death of your brain? Or is everything you call yourself, memory, personality, love, consciousness itself, nothing more than biology fully explained in principle by the physical machinery of the brain? This documentary weighs the biological firing of synapses against the metaphysical claim of an eternal essence. We'll examine real neuroscience, brain trauma, split brain surgery, neuroplasticity, against centuries of religious and philosophical dualism. And ask honestly, does consciousness survive physical decay? Or does it remain permanently tethered to gray matter? What exactly is dualism claiming? Before weighing evidence, we need to be precise about the claim itself. Philosophical dualism, most famously articulated by René Descartes in his 1641 work, Meditations on First Philosophy, holds that mind and body are two fundamentally different kinds of substance. The body is physical, extended in space, governed by mechanical laws. The mind, or soul, is non-physical, a thinking substance not reducible to matter, capable in principle of existing independently of the body. Centuries earlier, the Persian philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, offered his own influential argument for the soul's independence from the body, sometimes called the flying man thought experiment. Imagine a person created fully formed, suspended in midair, deprived of all sensory contact with their own body, unable to see, touch, or feel any part of it. Ibn Sina argued this person would still, undeniably, be aware of their own existence and thinking, suggesting self-awareness doesn't logically depend on awareness of the physical body at all, and therefore the soul must be something distinct from it. This is the philosophical foundation the rest of this documentary tests. Not merely, do people believe in an afterlife, but the more precise claim that consciousness constitutes, or depends on, a substance genuinely separable from the physical brain. What do major religions actually teach about the soul? It's worth surveying this briefly and accurately, because popular assumptions often flatten real differences between traditions. Christianity generally teaches the soul is an immortal, immaterial essence created by God, capable of surviving bodily death and facing final judgment. Though Christian theologians themselves have long debated the precise relationship between soul and body. Thomas Aquinas, drawing on Aristotle, proposed hylomorphism, the soul as the animating form of the body, rather than a fully separate Cartesian substance, a notably more integrated model than Descartes would later propose. Islamic theology speaks of the ruh, spirit, and nafs, self or soul, described in the Quran as something God breathes into the human being, Surah As-Sajda 32:9, and which He alone fully comprehends in its nature, Surah Al-Isra 17:85. Judaism speaks of the neshama, a divine soul breath, alongside related concepts like nefesh and ruach, describing different dimensions of the self. Hindu philosophy centers on the Atman, an eternal, unchanging self ultimately identified, in many schools, with universal reality, Brahman itself. It's worth noting a genuine internal complication here. Buddhism, despite being commonly grouped with these other traditions, actually teaches the doctrine of anatta, or non-self, the view that no permanent, unchanging soul or self exists at all, and that the sense of a continuous I is itself, a kind of persistent illusion arising from ever-changing physical and mental processes. This means the religion versus neuroscience framing of this debate is itself a simplification. Not every major world religious tradition affirms a Cartesian-style eternal soul in the first place. The case of Phineas Gage, does brain damage prove the mind is the brain? Now to the neuroscience side of the ledger, and one of the most famous cases in the field's history. In 1848, railroad foreman Phineas Gage survived an accident in which a large iron rod was driven completely through his skull, destroying much of his left frontal lobe. Remarkably, Gage survived and retained basic cognitive function and memory. But according to the account of his physician, John Martin Harlow, published in the following years, Gage's personality changed dramatically. Previously described as responsible and even-tempered, he reportedly became impulsive, irreverent, and erratic. It's worth noting, in the interest of accuracy, that later historical analysis has found the original case documentation was thinner and more embellished by subsequent retellings than popular science communication often suggests. The core facts of the injury and some personality change are well documented, but the more dramatic, later characterizations of Gage's transformation likely exceed what Harlow's original, relatively brief reports actually established. Even accounting for that historical caution, the broader neuroscientific pattern Gage's case is often used to introduce has been repeatedly confirmed through more rigorous, better documented modern cases. Damage to specific brain regions reliably produces specific, predictable changes in personality, moral reasoning, memory, and even religious or spiritual experience. This is presented by materialist neuroscientists as strong evidence that what we call mind, or personality, isn't separate from the brain, but is, in a very direct sense, generated and sustained by specific physical brain structures. Damage the structure, and you demonstrably damage the person's psychological identity in predictable, mechanistically explicable ways. Split brain patients, one soul or two, perhaps the single most philosophically unsettling body of neuroscience evidence in this whole debate comes from split brain research. Beginning in the 1960s, neuroscientist Roger Sperry, who received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, in 1981, largely for this work, studied patients who had undergone a surgical procedure called corpus callosotomy, severing the corpus callosum, the band of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, typically performed at the time, as a treatment for severe epilepsy. Sperry's experiments revealed something remarkable. In controlled testing conditions, each hemisphere could process information and, in some cases, even direct behavior, somewhat independently of the other, as though, in certain carefully designed, experimental setups, two semi-independent streams of awareness were operating within a single skull. This poses a serious, direct philosophical challenge to a simple, unified, indivisible soul model. If consciousness or selfhood can, under specific surgical and experimental conditions, appear to functionally split following a physical intervention, what does that suggest about whether the soul is a single, simple, non-physical substance, as classical dualism holds, or something far more dependent on and structured by the physical architecture of the brain itself. Dualist philosophers and theologians have offered several responses worth presenting fairly. One argues that split-brain phenomena reflect a disruption in how a single, still unified soul expresses itself through, or accesses, a divided physical instrument. Not evidence of a literally divided soul itself, similar to how a single radio signal might produce garbled or divided output through a damaged receiver without the original broadcast itself being split. Critics of this response argue it risks becoming difficult to falsify, able to accommodate essentially any neurological finding after the fact by attributing it to instrument malfunction rather than genuine insight into the nature of the mind. What does neuroplasticity actually prove and not prove? Neuroplasticity, the brain's demonstrated capacity to physically reorganize itself, forming new neural connections in response to learning, injury, or experience, is often cited by materialist thinkers as further evidence against a fixed, unchanging soul. The evidence for neuroplasticity itself is not seriously disputed. It's one of modern neuroscience's most well-established findings, documented extensively in stroke rehabilitation, sensory adaptation, and learning research. What's more contested is what this finding actually implies philosophically. Materialist thinkers argue that a mind whose underlying physical substrate can be reshaped, damaged, and reorganized, with corresponding measurable changes in memory, skill, and even personality, is best explained as a direct physical process, not a separate substance merely inhabiting or operating a physical body. Dualist philosophers generally respond that neuroplasticity demonstrates the brain's remarkable adaptability as an instrument, but doesn't, on its own, settle whether there is or isn't a further, non-physical subject using that increasingly sophisticated instrument. The same way upgrading a musical instrument's construction doesn't tell you whether or not a musician exists separately from the instrument itself. The hard problem: why consciousness itself resists easy explanation. Here we arrive at what many philosophers consider the deepest, most stubborn issue in this entire debate, one that complicates a simple, confident materialist victory. In a highly influential 1995 paper, philosopher David Chalmers distinguished between what he called the easy problems of consciousness, explaining how the brain processes information, integrates sensory data, or controls behavior, all of which neuroscience has made genuine, substantial progress on, and the hard problem, explaining why any of that physical processing is accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why does processing red wavelength light produce the felt, subjective quality of seeing red, what philosophers call qualia, rather than simply occurring in the dark with no inner experience whatsoever, the way a camera processes light without any accompanying felt experience? This remains a genuinely unresolved, actively debated problem across contemporary philosophy of mind, not a fringe religious objection to mainstream science. Serious secular philosophers have proposed a range of responses. Some, like philosopher Daniel Dennett, argue the hard problem is itself a kind of philosophical illusion that will dissolve with sufficiently detailed physical explanation. Others, including philosophers who are not religious, have found the hard problem serious enough to motivate alternative positions like panpsychism, the view that some form of proto-consciousness might be a fundamental feature of physical reality itself rather than something purely biological brains uniquely generate. Dualists point to the hard problem's persistence as evidence supporting their view that consciousness may not be reducible to physical processes at all, while acknowledging, in the interest of fairness, that consciousness resists full explanation. So far, is a different, weaker claim than consciousness is therefore proven non-physical. Near-death experiences. What does the evidence actually show? This is probably the single most emotionally charged category of evidence in this debate, and it deserves careful, honest treatment rather than sensationalism in either direction. Near-death experiences, NDEs, vivid reports of consciousness, sometimes including apparent awareness of surrounding events occurring during cardiac arrest or other states of profound physiological crisis, have been documented across numerous cultures and reported by a meaningful percentage of cardiac arrest survivors. The most rigorous attempt to study this scientifically, the AWARE study led by critical care physician Sam Parnia, published in the journal Resuscitation in 2014, examined cardiac arrest patients across multiple hospitals, including hidden visual targets placed to test whether patients could later accurately report events observed from outside their physical body during the period of clinical death. The results were genuinely inconclusive rather than dramatically confirmatory in either direction. The study documented a comparatively small number of patients reporting some awareness during resuscitation, but almost none of the patients who survived and could be interviewed had actually been positioned to see the hidden visual targets. And the one reported case of apparent accurate perception during the relevant window has faced substantial methodological criticism regarding verification and potential alternative explanation. Mainstream neuroscience generally attributes NDE phenomena to documented physiological processes occurring in a dying or oxygen-deprived brain, including surges of neural activity, disrupted neurotransmitter systems, and known effects of cerebral hypoxia. While proponents of a dualist interpretation argue the vividness, consistency, and occasional, though not fully verified, reports of accurate external perception during flat EEG states remain difficult to fully explain through current physiological models alone. Honest treatment of this evidence requires acknowledging both. The phenomenon is real and documented, and its correct interpretation remains genuinely, scientifically contested rather than settled in either direction. The radio analogy, a sophisticated, dualist rebuttal. Dualist philosophers have developed a more sophisticated response to the brain damage evidence than simple denial, worth presenting on its own terms rather than dismissing quickly. Philosopher and psychologist William James, in his 18th lecture, Human Immortality, proposed what's sometimes called a transmission or filter theory of the brain's relationship to consciousness, suggesting the brain might function not as the producer of consciousness, the way a factory produces its product, but as a transmitter or filter for consciousness, the way a radio receiver transmits, but does not itself generate the broadcast signal it plays. On this model, damaging the brain would indeed distort, limit, or even silence the expression of consciousness through that body, exactly matching everything the brain trauma and split brain evidence shows, without the underlying consciousness itself necessarily being generated by, or fully dependent for its existence upon, the physical brain. C.S. Lewis made a similar argument in his 1947 book, Miracles, using the analogy of a damaged piano affecting the music that can be played through it without the pianist's own musical ability being the thing that's actually damaged. Materialist critics respond that this analogy, while intellectually serious, is unfalsifiable in practice, since every possible neurological finding can be reinterpreted as distorted transmission rather than direct production. After the fact, the theory doesn't generate any independent, testable prediction that would distinguish it from straightforward physicalism. Proponents respond that the same could be said of many foundational philosophical positions on either side of this debate, including physicalism's own often unstated assumption that mental states simply are brain states, an assumption, they argue, that is itself philosophically asserted rather than strictly empirically proven by any single experiment. So where does the evidence actually leave us? Bringing this together honestly, neuroscience has amassed an enormous, well-documented body of evidence establishing tight, reliable correlation between brain states and mental states, damage a specific region, and specific, predictable psychological changes reliably follow. Alter brain chemistry, and consciousness itself is measurably altered or abolished, as in anesthesia or deep sleep. This correlational evidence is not seriously disputed by any side of this debate. What remains genuinely, philosophically contested is the deeper interpretive question. These correlations don't settle by themselves. Does tight correlation between brain states and mental states prove identity, that the mind simply is brain activity, full stop? Or is it equally consistent with a dependency relationship where a genuinely distinct consciousness relies on and is expressed and constrained through a physical instrument it does not simply reduce to? This is precisely the unresolved fault line between contemporary physicalism and modern dualist philosophy. And it's worth being honest that this remains a live, actively argued question in professional philosophy of mind today. Not a matter neuroscience alone has definitively closed. So, is the soul real? What 20 minutes of evidence and argument can honestly offer isn't a verdict, but a clearer map of exactly where the real uncertainty lives. Neuroscience has convincingly shown that mind and brain are extraordinarily, intimately intertwined, arguably more intertwined than most religious traditions historically assumed. But intertwined is not automatically the same as identical, and the deepest question, whether subjective experience itself is fully, ultimately explicable in purely physical terms, or points toward something the equations and scans haven't yet, or perhaps can't ever, fully capture, remains open, argued seriously by capable thinkers, religious and secular alike, without a settled consensus answer. Perhaps that itself is the most honest place this particular question can currently leave us.